Hi everyone, my name is Hannah from the African Student Association, and I'll be giving the solidarity statement for this evening. First, I want to welcome you. Thank you for coming out, and thank you to the panel for coming out to speak to us. Again, my name is Hannah Gabriela, and I'm an officer for African Student Association. The reason we're here is to discuss how the fight against Jim Crow is parallel to Israeli apartheid, and to discuss international solidarity between similarly oppressed peoples. Oftentimes, it starts on a smaller scale, such as today, when students are organizing and they find solidarity within each other, such as ISO, ASA, and SUPER working together. The fight is not one that we can win alone. Power as we know it comes in numbers, and with global unity, we can fight together in order to find solidarity. That way, the goal, as SUPER is trying to show today, is to fight for equality for our brothers and sisters in Israel. With the U.S. being the largest donor of aid to Israel, we do need a lot of support in order to have a fighting chance to bring this equality sooner rather than later. The issue that we face today is the denial of the most basic rights to Palestinians in Israel, the same way that in the United States, people were denied the most basic rights under Jim Crow. I'd like to conclude with a quote from Alia Bunima, a Palestinian author and activist. She wrote, "Just like in the Jim Crow South and just like apartheid in South Africa, one day there is going to be equal rights for everyone between the river and the sea." This I believe to be very true, but at the same time, we should still remember that whether it be here or in South Africa, we still have a struggle to fight for, that our rights aren't complete yet, and to remember to continue to fight even here at home as well as abroad. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you to the International Socialist Organization and the African Student Association for putting this on and bringing SUPER, Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights, into work on this as well. SUPER is extremely happy to be working on this. This is exactly the kind of educational and discussion event that we like to bring to campus. And we're glad that you can all be here today. So let me tell you a little bit about SUPER and who we are and what we do. We are Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights. We are a diverse, student-led group made up of students, faculty, and community members around the University of Washington, and working to educate students and the broader community about the struggle for Palestinian equal rights. We are founded in response to the Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel, and we support the nonviolent methods of BDS until Israel meets its obligations to the Palestinian people and international law. We understand the struggle for Palestinian equal rights as intimately entangled in global struggles for economic, social, and cultural justice, including the struggles of other indigenous peoples around the world and the structural inequality we face in our own country. We understand that the true definition of solidarity is an honest understanding that our own liberation is tied up in the liberation of others, and that the oppressed must lead the struggle. As an anti-racist organization, SUPER condemns all forms of hatred and discrimination, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Today's event highlights the important, essential links between Palestinian solidarity and the history and ongoing work of anti-racism. We're thrilled to be co-sponsoring the event with ISO and the African Student Association, and we hope that this panel and discussion today will further solidarity on campus. SUPER does have a sign-up sheet if you'd like to know more about what we're doing on campus, and I'm sure ISO and the African Student Association have similar ones in the hallway. There'll be some time for discussion after the event, after the panel, and I will turn it over to Peter to introduce our panelists.
My name is Peter Weir. I'm a postdoc here at the University of Washington and a member of SUPER, Students United for Palestinian Equal Rights at the University of Washington. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday. I'm sure it'll be worth it. We have three distinguished panelists joining us today. Aaron Dixon is the founder of the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party here in Seattle. And that's been chronicled in his memoir, My People Are Rising, which you might have some copies of here. Pertinent for today, he has just returned from the Palestinian occupied territories as part of the Second African Heritage Delegation. Aaron was the Green Party candidate for the U.S. Senate in 2006, running on a platform of out of war and into our communities. Aaron currently serves as the executive director of Central House, a homeless shelter for youth, and he's here to share the lessons of his experience on the delegation to Palestine in person. Gerald Lenoir is, well, I'm not sure what order we'll be going in, but he has been a leader in the progressive social movements for over 30 years. He's currently the director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and a founding member and trip leader of the African Heritage Delegation to Palestine, and went, I think, last year and before that. He is currently a board member of the National Network for Immigration and Refugee Rights, and is a former executive director of the Black Coalition on AIDS in San Francisco, and co-founder and board chair of the HIV Education and Prevention Project in Alameda County in Oakland, California. He was a member of the editorial board of War Times, an anti-Iraq War newspaper, and a longtime leader in social justice, racial justice, and anti-South African apartheid movements in the United States. He also served as a strategic planning consultant for racial justice, immigration rights, and HIV/AIDS and health-related organizations and public health departments. Okay, our third speaker is Jesse Hagopian, a public school teacher here in Seattle and a founding member of Social Equality Educators. He's a contributing author to the recently published books Education and Capitalism, Struggles for Learning and Liberation, and 101 Changemakers. And do we have those?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so those are available also. He serves on the board of directors of Mahalilo, Many Hands Light Load, a Haiti solidarity organization, and he also traveled with the African Heritage Delegation to Palestine in 2011. So there will be time for discussion after these three presentations, and I hope you enjoy the panel.
All right. Thanks for everyone for coming out tonight and for making it here. You had a lot of obstacles, I think, to get here this afternoon. First, you had to believe that there is such a thing as Palestinian people. If you heard Newt Gingrich recently, he said they are, quote, an invented people. Right? Then you had to get past the barrier of Mitt Romney. If you heard the 47% hidden video comment, also in that video was a statement that Palestinians don't want peace, and it's not even worth working on a solution to the conflict in the Middle East. And then you had to get by a whole lot of organizations that told you that it's anti-Semitic to have any type of criticism of Israel and apartheid. And then I think finally, you had to be brave enough to come and hear from these dangerous people up front here. And I want to let you know how dangerous they are, right? We know Aaron founded the Black Panther Party here in Seattle and fed a whole lot of children warm breakfasts. And then we have my dad, Gerald, here. Look out, a dangerous guy, and I'll prove it to you. David Horwitz's website, he shared it with me recently, had a headline that read, Black Leaders Vendetta Against Israel. And then it read like this. It says, we are currently witnessing a sharp rise of a strong anti-Semitic movement among the Western black elite. Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple, just recently refused to authorize a Hebrew translation of her book, saying that, quote, Israel is guilty of apartheid and persecution of the Palestinian people, both inside Israel and also the occupied territories. Jeremiah Wright, Obama's pastor in Chicago, said that the Jewish state is a deformed modern apartheid. Then you have Jesse Jackson reaching out to Yasser Arafat. They say, quote, Toni Morrison charged Israel with the liquidation of Palestinian nation, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu repeatedly condemns, quote, Israeli apartheid. And finally, they write, Gerald Lenoir, Executive Director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and Education and Advocacy Group, declares that, quote, an African American who was a leader in the U.S. anti-apartheid movement I see the separate and unequal treatment of Palestinians as a form of apartheid and a crime against humanity. That's who we'll be hearing from in just a second. And I think you should maybe think about paying David Horowitz a little on the side for putting you with Toni Morrison. And that's pretty great. But of course, he doesn't mention that the most elite of all black people in this country, our president, actually has unwavering support for the state of Israel and continues to fund it to the tune of $3 billion a year to continue the occupation. But I think we can't deny the history of African American support for Palestinian liberation in this country. In 1969, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was a group that was instrumental in registering black people to vote in the South during the era of poll taxes and segregation, led the movement to break the back of Jim Crow and Southern segregation. And they came out with a statement in their newsletter that year condemning the state of Israel and its Zionist policies. And they were quickly criticized by another wing of the movement. Roy Wilkins, executive director of the NAACP, called it anti-Semitic. Then you had Whitney M. Young, Jr., executive director of the Urban League, said, quote, blacks had been victims of racism for far too long to revert to racial hatred against Jews. But I think this divide in the black movement on the question of Palestine was emblematic of the divide on a whole lot of issues. You had the urban black power groups with unequivocal support for the liberation of the Palestinian people. The Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party, CORE, stood with Palestine, while more moderate groups, SCLC, Urban League, NAACP, had some kind of support for Israel at various times. But I think it's the record of the Black Panther Party that really inspires me, and Aaron can talk a lot more about it, but they really advocated for international resistance to all forms of oppression, and that they saw rooted in a capitalist economic system that was split between imperialist nations that dominated others, and a system bent on profit. And they saw Israel and apartheid in that context. And in the Panther newspaper in August of 1969, they wrote, quote, we recognize our oppression takes different forms. Zionism in Palestine and racism here in America. But the case is the same. It's U.S. imperialism. The Black Panther Party believed that African Americans had a shared history of oppression with Palestinians. And amazingly, Panthers called for an Arab Spring in 1970, which blew me away to read that in their newspaper. They said, quote, the struggle for self-determination is first of all a revolutionary struggle against your own oppressive state. And they were talking to Arabs across the region saying, your governments pay lip service to liberation for Palestine while they oppress you, and they're clearly not going to be the force for liberation. You must rise up, overthrow your own autocratic states across the Middle East in a common struggle with Palestine. And I think we're beginning to see some of that right now with this Arab Spring unfolding. They argued that Israel would never be a secure state as long as they violated Palestinian rights, writing, quote, the survival of Palestinians and Jews depends on the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. And of course they were charged with anti-Semitism for saying that Palestinians have been pushed off their land in the Nakba and the catastrophe of '48 that captured their land. But Huey P. Newton called a press conference in September 5th of 1970 to address those charges. And I just want to read to you what he said there and then tell you a little bit about the delegation that I went on and why it was so important to me. So Huey said, quote, we are not anti-Semitic. As far as the Israeli people are concerned, we are not against the Jewish people. We are against that government that will persecute the Palestinian people. we have to admit that there's something wrong in the Middle East. The Palestinian people are living in hovels. They don't have land. They've been stripped and murdered, and we cannot support this for any reason. We also must realize some of the shortcomings of the United Arab Republic, and our views on this is that we think that the people led by the Palestinian people should be led into a struggle, a revolutionary struggle, in order to transform the Middle East into truly a people's republic. And, you know, when I went to Palestine, I traveled with this group up here of incredible folks, mostly older veterans of the civil rights movement, and got to see their firsthand accounts of and hear them explain the connections between what they lived in Jim Crow South and what they were seeing as we traveled on the trip to Palestine. And I want to get to a photo here of this man who was the founder of the Israeli Black Panther Party, which Aaron probably tell you more stories about because he talked to him as well. But I want to just say one story I heard. You know, they were debating. He's a Mizrahi Jew, and so he's Jewish, citizen of Israel, but because they are dark-skinned, right, they also experienced an incredible amount of racism as well, the worst housing, etc. And so in the 60s and 70s, they were organizing to fight back against that oppression of the Israeli state, and they were trying to figure out what to call themselves. And at first they threw out, let's be the Roaring Tigers. And you remember that? And then they're like, nah, let's go with the Black Panther Party. And they knew they were right when immediately the state puts them on the list of dangerous groups, and they're all over the newspaper. They knew they chose the right title. And they would go around stealing milk from rich Israelis and giving it to poor people. Subversive acts. But all this type of history of the black movement here in America supporting Palestine, and you know, the Palestinian resistance and the Israeli Black Panther Party, you can't know about that, because if you did, you might see a struggle that you identify with, that you support in ending segregation in this country, the same people fighting to end segregation in Israel. And you might start demanding that your tax dollars go to fixing the schools in our neighborhood rather than bombing people across the Middle East, right? And so Zionists have turned to pink washing, where they try to say, well, we should support you know, the stranglehold of Gaza basically being an open-air prison, because Israel's the only state that supports gay rights in the Middle East. And you should support the occupation of the West Bank for greenwashing, because they're the only one with a commitment to ecological and environmental rights. That's why you should support the killing and apartheid that goes on in that state. We can talk about those in a moment, but they've turned to a new strategy, which is blackwashing, which is trying to convince you that, you know, the oppression, well, basically cloaking the oppression of Palestinian people in the language of the civil rights movement, and getting as much support as they can from different black figures in America to show that Israel's on the side of the civil rights movement. So this was best shown for me by the Global News Service for the Jewish People, JTA, and a man named David Bernstein on February 9th, 2012 wrote, our goal must be to shore up the support, or 2011, excuse me, our goal must be to shore up the support of the next generation. In a recently released strategy paper called Burning Campus, Rethinking Israeli Advocacy on America's Universities and Colleges, the David Project suggests a new kind of advocacy that is meant to shape the campus discourse in Israel. The report asserts that campuses should first be mapped by student leaders and professionals. Mapping means identifying campus influencers, whether with individuals or groups. And he wrote that, quote, when I visited one campus last year, I was struck that an Asian and Latino American organizations were listed as co-sponsors of the anti-Israel activities on campus. It became clear that no one had ever bothered to reach out and build a friendship. It can start by grabbing a cup of coffee with the ethnic student leaders representing other student groups and ultimately lead to joint programs. And then, in an article by Ira Gluntz called Pro-Israeli Lobby Courts African Americans, he writes, quote, the Vanguard Leadership Group is an Atlanta-based AIPAC supported group that offers leadership training to students at historically black colleges. Its founder and executive director, Gerald Jordan, was present at the 2008 AIPAC Policy Conference, and there he claimed to have been inspired by the speech of President Obama, which led him to create an African American organization dedicated to improving African American and Jewish relations and the increased African American support for Israel. So there's a conscious strategy going out right now by the Israeli lobby to try to court African Americans, whining and dining, Jesse Jackson Jr. and other prominent African Americans, taking them on all expense paid trips to Israel and back, and trying to shore up support from this important segment of American society in order to get legitimacy for a state that's increasingly being seen around the world as belligerent, right? When you see them fire on the flotilla and kill unarmed people, many people begin to question if they're the bastion of democracy that they're being sold as. And so going to get black civil rights leaders is part of their strategy of shoring up legitimacy. And I just want to end with a couple stories from my trip to Palestine with that incredible group of people to highlight, I think, what some successful work can be done to undo that blackwashing that's going on. So I think one of the most powerful moments for me from that trip to Palestine was meeting at the Holy Land Trust Center, I believe. And we had our delegation of veterans from the Black Freedom Movement here, and we met with some of the leading activists in the Palestinian civil society movements there, and we just sat down to share stories. And they were sharing stories of, it became clear right away that they had a very deep knowledge of the American civil rights movement and were employing strategies of the nonviolent resistance that they had read about from our struggles here in this country. One of the ones that struck me the most was actions that they took during the first Intifada was they all decided they weren't going to go on daylight savings time. And the leadership of the movement decided not to change their clocks. And it drove the Israeli state crazy because the shops would open up at a time that wasn't designated, and it just showed the unity of Palestinian people and that the leadership of the resistance had wide influence in the Palestinian society, and it drove them crazy. So the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, would go and stop people on the street and check their watch. And if it was an hour off, they would smash the watch and oftentimes shatter wrists. But it was an acts like that helped to build mass movement. And we're in this room in the West Bank listening to these stories of resistance that they're telling us. And the one that was shared by Gloria, a woman on our delegation, I thought was, for me, the most powerful moment of the trip. When this woman, Gloria, she's probably in her late 60s, and she was a teacher in Mississippi during Jim Crow. and she was politically aware, and when Brown versus Board of Education gets handed down, she says, well, now we're going to integrate the schools in Mississippi. And of course, the superintendent said, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, we're not going to integrate the schools here in our little town. And so she took a lawsuit, partnered with the NAACP, and pushed through a court injunction and became a symbol of resistance to segregation there. And when the injunction went through, she went and confronted the school, and they finally said, okay, we'll let you in. And she was scheduled to start teaching on Monday, and she goes to work that day, and the school's surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan. And so, okay, I'm not going to go to work that day. So she goes back the next day, and for several weeks the Klan is surrounding, and she can't get in until finally a court injunction opens the school up, and they chase the Klan off, and she's able to start teaching there. And as she's telling this story, the Palestinian woman who had just told us about the watches is just crying, in tears to hear story from, someone she never knew, but a movement she knew so well. How people had, risked so much in the American South to stand up to segregation, and that the fact that they broke the back of segregation and Jim Crow through countless acts like that across the South of bravery and organizing movements. And one other experience that really stands out for me there was one of the last days before we were getting ready to leave. We saw that there was a book reading going on in East Jerusalem, and so we went to go see Omar Barghouti. And so we went to go see him do a reading, my dad and I, and we realized as we were walking there that we were walking to an illegal book reading, because the law had just passed when we were there that in Israel that is illegal to advocate for a boycott. And if you advocate for a boycott on any company, they can claim damages. So if they say their profit margin has gone down and you've advocated for a boycott, then you are liable for the amount of money they've lost, right? In the only democracy in the Middle East, we were going to an illegal book reading. So we go there. Incredible. If you haven't seen Omar Barghouti, please look him up online and hear his case for BDS. I can't go through it all right now, but I think you'll be left more convinced than ever after you've heard him speak. And we introduced ourselves during the panel and said we were with the African Heritage Delegation and thanked him. And he said how important it was that African Americans were speaking out for Palestinian rights, and gave us a really clear example of why. He said that there's a forest in Israel that's named the Coretta Scott King Forest. And they named it for Martin Luther King's wife in honor of a great civil rights leader. And turns out that forest was planted to hide the remains of a Palestinian village that had been burnt and destroyed. And to me, that was just the clearest symbol of why we need to reclaim the history of African Americans standing in solidarity with justice for Palestine. And so I hope to join with you guys in your campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions here. And I hope that we can build this struggle far and wide. Thank you.
I want to just first thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak, Super and ISO and African Student Association. I think gatherings like these are really critical for us to get an understanding of what's going on in the Middle East in general and in Israel and Palestine in particular. I want to thank my son Jesse for that wonderful speech, and it was really great to be a leader of that African Heritage Delegation and to have Jesse with me on that delegation. We had a different level of bonding on that trip, and so we're here today together to really, urge that if you can, you need to go and see for yourself what's going on. Don't just take our word for it. Interfaith Peace Builders is the group that we went with. One thing that was left out of my Bible is that when I came back the first time, I went in 2008 with the American Friends Service Committee's Third World Coalition, and IFPB, Interfaith Peace Builders, coordinated that trip. And when I came back, I joined the board of Interfaith Peace Builders, and then we began to plan for an African Heritage delegation. And so it's critically important, I think, that you go and see for yourself. Jim Crow, apartheid is alive and well in Palestine. I just want to pick up on some of the themes that Jesse introduced to us and really look at it in the context of what is now being called apartheid in the Holy Land. I now live in California, but I lived in Seattle here for many years and was one of the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement here in Seattle in 1970, from 1975 to 1978. I worked for the American Friends Service Committee doing a program on apartheid, anti-apartheid program here in Seattle. And then in the mid-'80s, when South Africa was aflame and the ANC and other liberation movements were rendering apartheid unworkable and the country ungovernable, I was co-chair of the Seattle Coalition Against Apartheid. And some of you in the room I know were at those demonstrations at the consulate. Amy, you were there. Jesse was there.
Yeah. On your shoulders, man.
Linda, you were there. So Emily was there. You know, there was a guy who was running the consulate out of his home in Madison Park. And so every Sunday, we would bring to his doorstep a demonstration that ranged anywhere from 100 people to 1,000 people on this very narrow street in Madison Park. And every week, for I don't know how many years that went on. I left Seattle in '86. We started in '84. I left in '86, and it still went on for at least another year and a half. Every Sunday, people going, knocking on the door. Police would come and say, "You're trespassing." We say we're not leaving until apartheid is dismantled. People would get arrested, and that went on. It was part of the cycle that was going on across the country, calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in South Africa. And the rest is history. We know that in 1986, the Anti-Apartheid Act was passed in these United States. And that was a major blow. One of South Africa's major assets, the United States, had withdrawn its support as a result of intense pressure that was rooted in the African American community. It was the first time that African Americans had a major impact on U.S. foreign policy. The first time, and so it set a signal to South Africa that it was time to negotiate. It was time to give up on this madness. It was time to give up on apartheid. And so I'm very proud to say that I was part of that movement. And I'm also very proud to say I'm now a part of the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. Because it is an apartheid state. Make no mistake about it. It is an apartheid state. Jesse mentioned the Vanguard Leadership Group. It's an African-American group of young folks centered in Atlanta, Georgia, at historically black colleges that AIPAC and other pro-Israeli groups have put together as a front to advocate in African-American communities that Israel is our friend and we should support the state of Israel, and it's the Palestinians who are terrorists. And so it's very important, from my way of thinking, that African Americans in particular step up and really look at how we can support the struggle of Palestinians at this particular moment. What I can tell you is that from my experience going on the two delegations, it's very clear. If you go there, it's in your face oppression. There's nothing subtle about it. The checkpoints are incredible. People can't travel freely, similar to what happened in apartheid South Africa. People have to have papers to travel, and then they oftentimes will hang you up at these checkpoints for hours. Sometimes you don't get through. We heard stories about pregnant women who were trying to get to the hospital, were held up at the checkpoints, and their babies were born at the checkpoint or their babies died. This is a regular routine happening. I witnessed, I was on the first time I went, I was on a public bus on my way to one of the villages with a group of us that were on the delegation. Armed soldiers got on the bus carrying semi-automatic rifles with their fingers on the trigger and began to go down the road asking for papers. One of the Palestinian men on the bus did not have the right papers. He was taken off the bus. And our guide that was with us says this happens all the time, and they don't know what would happen to that guy. He could be let out in a few hours, in a few days, in a few weeks, a few months, in a few years, or he may never be heard from again. You never know what's going to happen when they take you away. And so, again, the analogy with apartheid, that lack of freedom for travel, is real. The whole land question, 40% of what is supposed to be Palestinian land in the West Bank is now occupied by Israeli soldiers and by Israeli settlers. The apartheid roads, there are roads in the country that are only for Israelis. If you have the wrong license plate on your car and you're traveling those roads, you're subject to be arrested. And they're, of course, the best roads. The apartheid wall, was the separation wall that's called the apartheid wall, takes up 14% of the land that's supposed to be Palestinian. And it doesn't conform to what is supposed to be the boundaries between the West Bank and Israel. What it conforms to is where there is water and where there is mineral wealth. That's where the wall goes. And so we see again the analogy with apartheid, that the theft of land and if you look at a map now of where the Israeli settlements are throughout the West Bank, you'll see that much of the time the land is not contiguous throughout the West Bank. That is, you have these little pockets of land that are completely surrounded by Israeli settlements that have no connection to the rest of Palestinian territories. And you see that configuration is similar to the Bantustan arrangement in South Africa. So the issue of land, again, is an issue that we see in the case of the Palestinians. And we witness firsthand the harassment, again, of Palestinians. One of our guides, we went to Hebron. Now, Hebron is a really particular situation because in most of the West Bank, the settlements sit up on hills above Palestinian villages, so they have, they can see what's going on, and they are guarded by Israeli soldiers. In Hebron, they have moved directly into a Palestinian town, have just kicked people out of their apartments, and have just taken over their apartments. And so it's particularly tense city. So there was a group of international peace, what do they call international peace witness, that escort young Palestinian children to school because Israelis will throw trash at them, spit on them, hit them, and so internationals have come together to try to, help people, even in that small way, of helping kids to get to school because there's so much harassment. And so, this Vanguard Leadership Group has condemned this notion that Israel is an apartheid state, but our eyes saw the reality of that. Even within Israel proper, 93% of the land is controlled by the Jewish, by a land trust that doesn't allow it to be sold to Palestinians. And so, again, apartheid is alive and well in Palestine and Israel. I mentioned the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement in this country against South Africa. It's a tactic that works. We here in Seattle, we boycotted Seafirst Bank because they were giving loans to South Africa. We staged demonstrations where we all went in and took our money out. Here at the University of Washington, in 1978, David Arunga was then the president of the Associated Students. He was a student from Kenya. So we joined with the Associated Students. We joined with the Minority Student Association that was then headed by Judy Hightower, who is now a judge in this town, and several other groups, the Black Student Union, and we put forward a resolution to the Board of Regents to divest from all the holdings that were in South Africa. In 1978, they unanimously rejected that argument. By the mid-1980s, they were divested. So in about 7 or 8 years, the movement had gathered so much movement. The students were doing shanty towns in Red Square. They were doing teach-ins. And so we know that the tactic works. But we also know that it takes organizing, it takes time, because the divestment movement started in the 50s, y'all, South Africa, quite as it's kept. You know, it didn't start in the 80s, it didn't start in the 70s, it started in the 50s. Paul Robeson was part of that movement. The American Committee on Africa was part of that movement. And so we know that with persistence and with organizing, that boycott, divestment, and sanctions can bring a country to its knees. And so I would encourage you, as students, as activists in the community, to continue to put the pressure on Israel. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for coming out on this cold autumn evening, Saturday. A lot of football is going on. So we got a much more important issue than football, as much as I love football. First of all, let me start that as a member of the Black Panther Party, we had a long history in support of the Palestinian movement. You know, we had an international section in our newspaper, and we always had articles in there about Palestine and the PLO and the Palestinian movement, what was occurring there. And when we had our international section in Algeria, Yasser Arafat came and visited with Eldridge and Don Cox, the field marshal, and other members of the Black Panther Party. He also brought a case of AK-47s with him. And I entered the Black Panther Party. And our field marshal, Don Cox, also visited many of the PLO training camps. So we have a long history, and we followed their struggle for a very long time, and have always hoped that they would, eventually find victory. So going over on this delegation, I didn't really know what to expect. You know, I heard a lot about what was going on in Palestine and what was Israel's position, and I found that it was much worse than what I thought. It was much diabolical than I could ever imagine. First of all, we got to Jerusalem. That's where we were staying at a hotel in Jerusalem, and we traveled around. Every morning we left about 8 in the morning, and we returned about 7 in the evening, and we visited a lot of different sites and talked to a lot of different people. But it was really difficult to tell how far we went and where we were going and what direction we were going in, because they had the area so carved up. And as it was pointed out, they had highways for the Israelis and highways for the Palestinians, which were not in the best condition. Then they had the wall was zigzagging here and there and cutting off roads and cutting off neighborhoods and cutting off villages. It was like a twilight zone. And everywhere you looked, there were Israeli soldiers with M16s and with Uzis, some other types of machine guns, and these were automatic weapons. They weren't semi-automatic weapons. These were automatic weapons. And they had their hand on the trigger. Every last one of them had their hand on the trigger. One of the first places that we visited was the ruins of a little village called Litka. And Litka was attacked in 1947, but just looking at this little village and the ruins of the village, you could tell that this was a little paradise for the Palestinians that lived in this village. It was in a valley. It had beautiful trees and beautiful flowers. It had a stream running through it. It had beautiful architecture. These buildings that were made out of brick, and let me just say this, is the Palestinians are master builders. And they build most of the buildings for Israel. But this village was just really beautiful, and you could just tell that it was a very peaceful place. And in 1947, a gang of Israeli soldiers, what's the name of that gang? Stern gang. The Stern gang came down and killed about 18 of the villagers. And they were so frightened, they didn't know what to do, so they left. They just left everything there. They left their money, they left their gold, they left their furniture, because they thought they were going to come back in a week and get it. They thought everything would be calmed down and everything would be okay, but they were never able to come back. And this village is over 200 years old. And it really showed, looking at that village, it really showed you the pain and the suffering that the Palestinian people have gone through since the beginning of the occupation and the beginning of the Israeli government to take their land and move them off their land. As Mr. Lenoir was talking about, we went to Hebron. And we were supposed to meet with an Israeli settler who was actually from New York. And a lot of the settlers are from New York. They're bringing them from New York. They're bringing these racist bastards from all over the U.S. to occupy these settlements all over Palestine. But this guy was packing a 9mm Glock. And we asked him if he would remove it, but he said no. So I and another young lady from Chicago, we refused to meet with him. But he began telling his lies, and we just didn't want to hear it. But he said he needed the Glock for his protection against the terrorists. And when truth, there hasn't been any armed Palestinians in Jerusalem and Bethlehem or Hebron for many, many, many years. And everywhere we went, we saw, there was a circle with the AK-47 and a line drawn through the AK-47. Because the Palestinians are keenly aware that violence is not going to work for them. They understand that violence is not going to work. So they completely embraced nonviolence. And it really began to change me and my whole attitude about violence as opposed to nonviolence. Just watching the Palestinian people, how they went about going about dealing with this occupation in a very nonviolent manner. But getting back to Hebron, it just shows you the insanity of what Israel is doing. This was a beautiful Palestinian village. This was a village where Palestinians made some of the best ceramics, the best jewelry, some of the best things that they have to offer. And they're known throughout the world for making these fine ceramics and fine other things. And when the occupation began, Israeli closed up 60 to 70% of their shops. And only a few of the shops remained open. And While walking through the shops, we looked up and we saw a mesh wiring over the streets, and we asked what that was, and what they said was that was to protect them from the Israeli settlements, because what the Israeli settlements have been doing is throwing garbage down on the Palestinian shops and down on the people. They were even throwing acid down on the people. So they had to put this up there to protect them. And there are 400 settlers in Hebron, and there's 2,500 armed to the teeth Israeli soldiers there to protect them. So there's 4 soldiers for every person who is in the settlement. And in Hebron is the mosque where an Israeli settler went in with a machine gun and killed 39 Palestinians. Just gunned them down while they were praying, and wounded about 55 more. So who is the terrorist here? Who is the real terrorist? We went to another village called, well, first we went to Ramallah to get to Benin. Ramallah is one of the larger Palestinian cities, and somebody said it was like the New York of Palestine. And it's a very big place, and a lot of people on the streets, a lot of people moving around. But it was sad to find out that all those people, I think it was 135,000 people, Palestinians that live in Ramallah, none of them can leave. They cannot leave Ramallah. They are confined there. So we traveled up to Benin, which is a little village amongst olive groves. And this was the scene where a documentary was shot called 5 Broken Cameras. And if you haven't seen that film, you have to make sure that you go see that film. I had an opportunity to see that film a year ago. And it's about a Palestinian father who bought a video camera at the birth of his first son. And it just so happened it was also the beginning of the first Intifada. So he began to film not only his son, but he also began to film the Intifada. And you know, every day the villagers would all get together to protest the building of the wall. And in that film was a Palestinian young man. He had a long hair. He was very happy-go-lucky. You tell he was a very happy person. The kids in the village followed him around everywhere, and he was always the one that was always very positive out of all the villages. He was always smiling. He was always happy. But during the filming of the Intifada, he was murdered by the Israeli security. He was just shot in cold blood, you know, just because he was protesting, shot in the chest. There was another young man in that film who was also part of the Intifada, and you could see him being handcuffed, him being taken back to the Israeli security police car, and they just turned their M16 on him and shot him in the leg for no reason, just shot him in the leg. So being in this village and having watched this film was really very moving and very touching. And our guide showed us around. He took us to where the wall was, and he showed us the settlement sitting up on the hill, and we could smell the tear gas that they had used against the Palestinian protesters the day before. And we also smelled the skunk oil that Israeli used to spray on the protesters as well. We also saw the olive trees that had been burned by settlers who snuck into the village at night and burned down their olive trees. And these olive trees are sacred to the Palestinians. They've had these olive trees for thousands of years. This is how they make a living, by harvesting and taking care of their olive trees. And they've become a target of the Israeli Defense Force. We also saw a grove where there were 1,000 olive trees had been cut down by the Israeli Defense Force. 1,000 olive trees had been cut down as punishment against them protesting. We also went to a Bedouin village. You can't really call it a village, but we went to a Bedouin tribes where they were living. And the Bedouins have lived in the Sinai. They've been living in Israel for thousands of years. And you know, they live in the desert. That's their life, living in the desert. And Israel has also had a campaign against them, moving them off of their traditional lands where they go with their camels and their goats, and putting them in a little strip near the freeway, not allowing them to build any kind of shelter. You know, they were able to put together a little school for their kids, and they mentioned to their home. They built another part which is separate from the home, but it's kind of like another wing so that they could bring more family members in. And they are not allowed to build anything. They can't build an extra bathroom. Palestinians, they can't build an extra bathroom. They can't even build a closet. And if the Israeli Defense Forces find out that they have built anything in their home, they will come down and destroy their home. So anyway, while we were sitting outside meeting with them, and actually the Israeli settlers had taken over this addition that they had built. They just took it over and just moved on in. And while we were sitting there meeting with them, the kids were outside playing. And the Israeli settler comes and scares the kids. The kids come running towards where we were crying because the settler is constantly intimidating them. And the Palestinian father was there with his 89-year-old mother. His 89-year-old mother had been arrested 5 times, had been hospitalized 4 times because she had been beaten up by the Israeli Defense Forces. And they told us that when they came over to take over someone's house, 400 soldiers would show up at 4 in the morning with machine guns, and they would make everybody get out of the house, and they would completely take their house over and bring the settlers in to take over their house. And the Palestinians would have to live in the street, and they would build tents in the street. They would tear down the tents and they build them again, back and forth. It's a constant struggle, a constant battle for the Palestinian people. So we saw many examples of this. And we also got a chance to meet with some activists in Israel, because there are a lot of people in Israel who are supportive of the Palestinian movement, who are doing a lot of tremendous work. And we met with this woman who started an organization to help Israeli young people from not having to serve in the Israeli Defense Forces. And she has 6 kids, and her oldest daughter went into the service, but her other 5 kids did not have to serve. And I asked her about the war with Hezbollah, and she said when they had the war with Hezbollah, that she got 400 calls a day from Israeli parents wanting to get their kids out of the army and get them to Europe. 400 a day. So that tells you right there that those young people, those young soldiers who are in the Israeli Defense Forces, they really don't have the stomach for this. You know, they really don't have the stomach for this kind of occupation anymore. And what was really uplifting was just spending time with the Palestinian people and just talking to them. Because, you know, the first couple of days for myself, I was very angry and I was very emotional at what I was seeing. But what I realized that is not what the Palestinian people need. They don't need our sympathy. They don't need our pity, because they are very strong people. They're some of the most strongest people I've ever encountered. And they know that they are going to win. They know that they're going to win this war. Because half the population that lives in Israel are Palestinians. There are more Palestinians in that territory than there are Israelis. They're having more babies than the Israelis have. And Israel is losing as many people as they're bringing over. They are losing that same amount of people. And so on the last day I was there, I was sitting in Jerusalem, in the old city. I was drinking some juice, talking to an old Palestinian man, and he had just returned back from Miami. He had lived in Miami for a very long time, and he shared with me that, you know, that when he got back to Palestine, to Jerusalem, that they took his passport, and that he can't leave Jerusalem. Not only can't he can't leave the country, but he cannot leave Jerusalem. He is a prisoner in Jerusalem. He cannot go anywhere else. And we were talking about what the future held, and he said the same thing that many Palestinians said. He said that we're going to wait this out. We're going to wait this out. We're going to win. We're going to be successful, and it's just a matter of time. And Israel has adopted a neoliberal economic policy, and that's how they operate their economic system. And it's not sustainable. Just like it's not sustainable here in the U.S., but Israel, with a small country, is really not sustainable there. We went to a small Israeli city called Jaffa. It used to be called Jaffa when Palestinians lived there. And they produce some of the best oranges in the world. And they ship these oranges all over the world. And what Israel has done, because their economic policy is, they sold their oranges to Spain and cut down all their orange trees and built houses on them and built settlements. And we got a chance to go into one of these settlements. First, we were down where the Bedouins were living, and we learned about the water, and it's correct that this wall has nothing to do with security. This ugly, drastic wall that they've built all through Palestine has nothing to do with security. It's about the water, because all of the water in that area has been in Palestinian territory, Palestinian lands. And what they've done is they have taken over the water, and they ration the water out to the Palestinians. So all the Palestinian homes have these water tanks on top, and they get an allotment of water, every week or every month. Whereas there's no water towers on the Israeli homes. And so we went into one of these big settlements, and it was like growing up in Beverly Hills or something. They had all these malls, and they had water fountains and swimming pools everywhere, and they had people from Asia and all over other parts of the world that were taking care of the elderly, and they're getting worried about that now. It was crazy. It was insane that here they built these monstrosity settlements that look like Beverly Hills, and they're treating the Palestinians as if they don't exist. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do, but the good side is that 63% of Americans do not support the Israeli state in its current, in terms of what they're doing. A lot of people in this country do not support it. A lot of the countries throughout the world do not support it. It's the leaders of this country, it's our Congress and it's our senators who have gotten funds from the Israeli lobby that keep them propping this illegitimate government up. So, we have to talk to everybody. We have to talk to our mothers and our fathers and our sisters and brothers and our cousins and our friends, and we have to educate people what really is going on in Israel in our name. Now, mind you, $3 billion of our taxpayer money, this is our hard-earned money that we make, is going to suppress and treat the Palestinian people like they're animals. Not just the Palestinian people, but I would say Israel is the most racist state in the world. Because currently there are 3,000 refugees from Darfur who have ended up in Israel because there is nowhere to go. When they left Darfur and went through the desert, the only place they couldn't get into Egypt, the only place they could get into was Israel. And now the Israeli government refuses to recognize them as refugees, is refusing to give them the things that they are supposed to give them as refugees. And many of them are sleeping in the park in Tel Aviv. They've taken all their belongings and put them in a huge container. And that's where all their belongings are. And they're threatening to send them back to Darfur where they are facing murder and execution. Also, thousands of Eritreans have ended up in Israel as well. And they are threatening to do the same thing to them. So, you know, this is really a diabolical, evil system that exists in the Middle East. And we have to bring it down. And I'm after visiting with the Palestinian people, I know that we will be successful. So, you know, we have to spread the word. We have to educate our friends about what's really going on. Thank you.